Thank you. Okay, good morning and welcome to All Saints Antiochian Christian Church in Chicago, Illinois. It is Saturday, March 29th, 2025, and this is the first of two presentations, one this morning, one this afternoon, on a Lenten pilgrimage to the Holy Land for All Saints Annual Ladies Retreat. This is going to be a sort of virtual pilgrimage. It focuses on the places and events that we observe during Orthodox Holy Week. But since it is Lent, I think we should start in prayer. This litany of humility, this actually was given to me by Father Andrew back when we were collaborating at St. George in Spring Valley. It was published by a Roman Catholic bishop, but I've used it in these presentations before. It seems to have a very Lenten spirit. So let's take a minute and recite it together. And I've got to come out and stand with you so that I can see the screen. I will read the verses. You guys can all respond with the responses. On the first column, after hear me the responses, deliver me Jesus. And then the second column, Jesus grant me the grace to desire it. O Jesus, meek and humble of heart,
hear me.
From the desire of being esteemed,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the desire of being loved,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the desire of being extolled,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the desire of being honored,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the desire of being praised,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the desire of being preferred to others,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the desire of being consulted,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the desire of being approved,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the fear of being humiliated,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the fear of being despised,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the fear of suffering rebukes,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the fear of being calumniated,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the fear of being forgotten,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the fear of being ridiculed,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the fear of being wronged,
Deliver me, Jesus.
From the fear of being suspected,
Deliver me, Jesus.
that others may be loved more than I,
Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it.
that others may be esteemed more than I,
Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it.
that in the opinion of the world others may increase and I may decrease,
Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it.
that others may be chosen and I set aside,
Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it.
that others may be praised and I unnoticed,
Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it.
that others may be preferred to me in everything,
Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it.
that others may become holier than I, provided that I become holy as I should.
Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it.
Amen. That's also a very appropriate thing to be praying when you're standing up and delivering a lot of pontifical information. Reminds you that you're not so special after all. He wasn't the author, but the popularizer of this litany, the Cardinal Mary del Val, is kind of appropriate to our topic today. He lived from 1865 to 1930, so he was late 19th, early 20th century. Very learned man. He had 2 doctorates. He served as Secretary of State to Pope Pius X, and he is currently a candidate for sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church. But on the other hand, the connection with the Holy Land. On the one hand, he was involved in early discussions with the British about their support for Zionism, and as you may know, and as we'll talk about briefly, the British pushed the state of Israel pretty eagerly for some decades. But on the other hand, as I'll keep saying that, he's also, Cardinal Mary del Val, is also known to have voiced prejudices against Jews quite publicly. Some of the prejudices that have been a burden of the church for years, blaming the Jews as Christ killers and so on. And I thought it was useful to mention this because there are a lot of paradoxes like this in the Holy Land that we will run across as we go. So on to our virtual tour, and I want to make two things clear to start. It's kind of two knots. One is this will not be exactly Holy Week in the Holy Land. We thought of that as a theme, but we've never actually been in the Holy Land during Holy Week. The two times we visited, 2013 and 2019, but actually started in Bright Week. So we were there during the Pascha season, but not the Holy Week. What this will be is the places and details behind the events that we celebrate during Holy Week. And those events cover Jesus's final journey to Jerusalem. And I've got final blank weeks there because we're not quite sure how many weeks that took, and it varies from gospel to gospel. Of course, his final days are vitally important, but interestingly enough, the different evangelists focus on them to different extents. Luke actually talks about at least, it's only about 25% of his text, although of course his text is the longest of the Gospels. Matthew, a little bit more, about 9 chapters. But both Mark and John devote 50% or more of their text to the final events, the conclusion of his life, his sacrifice and his resurrection. And it's the sites where those things happen that we'll be seeing today. Now, I said there were two knots. The other knot, I'm not an expert. I only partly in jest asked if anybody had been in the Holy Land and invited them to present instead of me. I mean, I've been there twice, but I'm an Orthodox layman. I'm a convert. I have studied these places and these events, but every study that I do makes me increasingly aware of how little I know. Many of the details and insights that I'm going to convey to you today, it came from our guides on these trips, and the main three are here on this slide. Lower left, Father Ilya Gotlinski. He's an OCA priest who has a tour company that I'll mention toward the end of the morning. He's taken us to many Orthodox countries over the last 12 years. In the center, now Archbishop, he was only a bishop back then, but Michael of New York, the OCA Bishop of New York, was with us in 2013. And upper right with Bishop Michael, Alexander, whom we know as Sasha. He was with us both in 2013 and 2019. And if you ever take a tour of the Holy Land, try to get Sasha as your guide. He's a fascinating guy. He's an American emigre. He was born in California, but his father traveled around a lot. He's a convert to Orthodoxy, and I believe he started out as a Jew. He's a veteran tour guide, enormously knowledgeable, speaks multiple languages. In fact, when he was talking with us in English, sometimes he had to stop and grope for a word because he had Russian and Hebrew and Greek and everything else running around in his head too. He knows everybody, and he shaped our impressions of this area in many ways. And I will be quoting him fairly often as we go through. But anyway, to the point, I'm not an expert. If anybody hears something they think is wrong or wants to add something, just plunge right in. All right, so finally, on to the Holy Land. And forgive me if for the next few minutes you see a lot of maps, but I think we need to see the big picture before I start showing you a lot of other pictures. This is the general area. It's the eastern end of the Mediterranean, historically called the Levant. It's often, or at least used to be called the Middle East. That sounds kind of far away from everything. But if you look up at the top of this map, you see Russia there at the eastern end of the Black Sea. To the Russians, this is not the Middle East. This is the near southwest. And that helps explain a lot of the conflict in the last couple of centuries. And we'll be mentioning that as we go along. According to Genesis, this is the area where creation occurred and where the Garden of Eden was. It's described as being between 4 rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Pishon, and the Gihon. Nobody is quite sure what rivers the Pishon and the Gihon were or are. This map shows one interpretation of where that area might have been in general terms. But even after Eden was removed from the physical world after the fall, this area became the cradle of civilization. It's ultimately where God's chosen people settled among the various related peoples related to them and their enemies. It's where, as I like to say, where God created history. And then when he entered history himself, ultimately by becoming a man. Holy Land is not a term that we just use today. This is literally Holy Land, and it's been called the Holy Land for centuries. Our experience there was that everybody is more aware of the presence of God than any other place. even when that awareness may be keeping them at each other's throats. We continually noticed, especially on the first trip, I noticed everybody was saying inshallah, which is Arabic for if God wills. Muslims, Christians, maybe even if Jews were speaking Arabic, you would hear inshallah from them every other word. Now, Sasha, I mentioned earlier, he lived in Jerusalem for many years. He has friends from all different backgrounds. All the times we traveled with him, I never heard him refer to Christians or Muslims or Jews. His phrase was always, if he was talking about somebody non-Christian, our brothers according to the faith and our brothers according to the image of God. And I think this was his way of saying we all disagree about a lot, but we all agree that God is here and God is particularly present in the Holy Land, and that this land is an icon of God. And that's not just a turn of phrase. That belief in the Holy Land as an icon of God and of his church goes back a long way. And that's nowhere clearer than in this church, which is now in the country of Jordan, which was historically biblical Moab. This area was a Christian community very, very early. But over the centuries, it had fallen into ruins after the Muslims took over in the 7th century. And finally, in 1880, a group of Arab Christians moved back into this area and built a new church on the ruins of one that had existed in the 6th century and had been destroyed when the Muslims took over. I mean, you can see they were moving in. It was pretty much wilderness, and they built up a town around this church. They named the new town Madaba, which was the name of the original bishopric that had been in this area. So they weren't just moving in for real estate. They were moving in definitely in a Christian mission. And the church, as it says, if you can follow the Greek here, they named after Agia Georgos, or St. George, very common patron saint throughout the Holy Land, as he is among Antiochian churches in this country. This icon is in that church, by the way. Now, during construction of that church, remember they were on top of an old church, they discovered something that is absolutely unique. This is the floor of the ancient church, and it was an enormous mosaic map of the Holy Land. It's estimated this mosaic contains more than 2 million tesserae. Those are the little pieces that are made into mosaics. In the case of the ancient Holy Land mosaics, they were usually limestone that was naturally colored in all these different colors, which is one reason it's lasted as long as it has. Unfortunately, when they discovered it, it was not completely intact, and it had been damaged a little more during construction, which is why you see the gaps in it. But what survives is still hugely impressive, and it is the earliest extant expression or representation of the Holy Land. You can see here it depicts a lot more than just Israel. It goes across the Jordan, and it goes as far as the Nile Delta. And if you're having a little trouble following this compared to maps that we're used to, that's because up on this map is not north, which is the way we think of maps. In ancient Christian maps, actually ancient maps, not only Christian, up was often east, just like churches are pointed east. So if you turn the whole map at 90 degrees, you can follow it a little better. Now you can probably easily see that big body of water there is the Dead Sea. Presumably the Sea of Galilee was on the map up there, but was lost in the damage over the centuries. Now, zooming in on its representation of Israel, which is circled here, notice in Greek, it's described as the Holy City. So they were already talking about Jerusalem as the Holy City, 5th, 6th century, whenever this was originally done. Now, the Jerusalem illustrated here, of course, is not the Jerusalem that was there at the time of Christ. Because that was destroyed in 70 AD, and then it was rebuilt as a Christian city starting in the 4th century. This graphic calls out some of the principal landmarks of that 6th century city that was represented. We'll visit a couple of them later today, particularly the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is represented here. Looking at this 6th century representation of the Holy City is probably as good a time as any to pause a minute and make kind of 2 more general observations about what you're going to see. And these were conclusions that we came to fairly soon when we first visited. One, as I like to say, antiquity is relative. And the other is, as a result, there are layers of history in a lot of places, but particularly the Holy Land. So antiquity is relative. That's just one example. This is the Damascus Gate, which is how you enter the old city of Jerusalem, as they call it today, on your way to the Holy Sepulchre. Now, you look at that and you say, that's really old. Well, it is really old, but in this case, old means 16th century. Those walls were built after the Ottoman Empire conquered Jerusalem. So these ancient-looking walls are much closer to our own time than they were to the time of Jesus. And this takes some getting used to. You go to the Holy Land expecting to see everything from the time of Christ, and not really. It's covers 20 centuries. To see anything from the Roman era, you have to look much farther down, like this stonework at the base of these walls around Jerusalem. Those probably date to about when the Emperor Hadrian built a city he called Aelia Capitolina in the 2nd century AD. This was over the ruins of Jerusalem. Capitolina means capital. Aelia referred to the name of Hadrian's family. The ancient walls of Jerusalem itself are probably even further down. They're buried under this level. To see anything from actual gospel times, you see ruins, and generally you have to dig. This is an example. This is a theater built by Herod the Great in Samaria, a city he named Sebast after the Greek term for Augustus. He was currying favor with the Emperor Augustus and thought Augustus would be thrilled if he named a city after him in Greek. Now, this is from the 1st century BC, and it had to be extensively excavated to be even this visible. I said that this was where God created history, and you can see from this there are layers of history beneath your feet practically everywhere you walk on the Holy Land. And you'll see a couple of examples of where people later in the talks, where people started something and started digging and then immediately had to stop and call the archaeologists because they found something unexpected. One example of the layers of history is this church. This is the Church of Jacob's Well. It's in the Palestinian city of Nablus. Now, this is the site, as you may recognize, where Jesus spoke with the Samaritan woman. So now we're back to the time of the Gospels. She later became Saint Photinie. You remember the story. She came to draw water. He told her he could give her living water. They had a long discussion. In fact, the day that scripture comes up, that gospel comes up as the prescribed reading at Divine Liturgy, it's the longest gospel that's ever read. And she was so impressed by his understanding of her life and a lot of other things that she told everybody in town, and many of the Samaritans believed. There have been Christian churches on this site since at least the 4th century, at least when they started building Christian churches. They've been destroyed and rebuilt a number of times. This current church, as ancient as it probably looks, it was completed in the 1980s. It was started in the 1930s, I think. Much of the interior decor, including the iconography and ironwork, was done by the current priest who has been serving there since about 1980. And it's a lovely and deeply spiritual place. But in order to get to the real historical site of veneration, you have to go down a long flight of steps at the side of the iconostasis. And this illustrates something you will see a lot today. When you visit ancient places, not just true in the Holy Land, but other places, ground level 2,000 years ago is normally about 15 to 20 feet or so below ground level today. You're always going down. Now, that does not mean, as people then ask, well, does that mean the earth is getting bigger? No, it has to do with stuff getting moved around in places that have been civilized. But get used to looking down and digging. Those steps go down to a cavern which is underneath the altar. And it's been built around the well that was described in the 33rd chapter of Genesis. Jacob, as you may recall, purchased land near what was then called Shechem or Sychar. And pilgrims can still descend and taste the water from that well. That's the water that Jacob, who became Israel, used to water his flocks. And that well is also where a couple of thousand years later, the woman came to the well and Jesus brought the good news to her and then to the town. Now, this church in Nablus, Palestine, is one of many examples I could show you of what I call layers of history, places that have been significant time and again across the centuries. And unfortunately, it's also an illustration that history hasn't stopped. It keeps going. So you can have Old Testament, New Testament, and today. And it can be as violent today as it was thousands of years ago. If you look closely at this photo of the bell tower of St. Photinie's Church, that is a chunk that was taken out of the masonry by artillery some years ago during a clash between the Israeli army and the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the first time we were there in 2013, we saw another less dramatic example of this. We happened to arrive on May 16th. That's the day after the Palestinians observe what they call the Nakba, the catastrophe, which is the anniversary of the foundation of the nation of Israel. On that day, the day before we'd been there, a Palestinian mob surrounded the church. The church locked its gates. They couldn't get in, but they threw rocks, which you see scattered on the pavement here, until the police came in and dispersed them. Now, the mob did not really have anything against the church or against Christians. They were just expressing their general fury at their lack of statehood. And as I say, the next day, the rocks were still lying there as a sort of mute testimony to the problem. And then the year after we visited, we weren't there for this. I got this off the web, but there were violent protests. A 16-year-old boy had been killed during conflicts between the Israelis and Hamas. And Hamas, of course, brings it up to the present. The group Israel's been at war with since October of 2022. I'm not going to get into that, but the violence continues. Now, this riot was against the Palestinian Authority, not directly against Israel, but the history with Israel was the background of the riot. So the Holy Land's a place of veneration, of layers of history, but it's also conflict, and it has been a place of conflict for thousands of years. You know that from reading the Old Testament. Maybe because it's such a special place, people have fought over it as far back as we have records, and probably a lot farther than that. And I think it's important to go over some of that history before we get into looking at more pictures. If only for no other reason, Jesus was born into just such a time of conflict. So bear with me, I'm going to show you a few more maps. This is Israel at its furthest state of expansion, ancient Israel, under Solomon about 3,000 years ago. The area with the black border is Solomon's kingdom. The area with the red border is the modern nation of Israel, including the disputed areas called the West Bank. Now, even in Solomon and David's day, there were a lot of different peoples crowded into the same general place. This map shows Israel and its near neighbors. So this particular red line reaches beyond its borders into lands that they had various types of relationships with. Sometimes they were tributaries to Israel, some they were trading partners, some were rivals or enemies. Notice particularly down here, Philistia. That's the area that David finally drove the Philistines back into. The Philistines were one of the adversaries of Israel, probably from the Greek islands originally. They're referred to as sea people, but nobody's quite sure. But that, interestingly enough, that area of Philistia is essentially the Gaza Strip today. Okay, now jump forward to 43 AD. We've just skipped 1,000 years. This is a map drawn by a Roman named Pomponius Mela. I know nothing about him other than the fact that he drew this map. Rome now rules the whole Mediterranean. Now, as with the Madaba map, in case you're trying to figure that, east is up here, so north is to the left. North is toward me. The area where Israel is today, the eastern portion is named Judea, and the portion by the sea is named Palestine. Now, the word Palestine, this was a Roman coinage, was derived from the word Philistine. So Palestine historically is the land of the Philistines, which is ironic since they were historically one of Israel's major antagonists. And the larger area of the Middle East was a province that the Romans called Syria. And that name continued for hundreds of years. When Hadrian built Aelia Capitolina over the rules of Jerusalem, he renamed Judea Syria Palestina. Roman Syria was a much larger area than the country by that name today. It was pretty much the entire eastern end of the Mediterranean. Now, this whole area in the next century or two became Christian, first through the efforts of the apostles and then by law under Constantine. Now, fast forward again another millennium, as the Western Roman Empire retreated from Northern Europe, second half of the first millennium. The Eastern Empire briefly controlled the entire Mediterranean basin. This is the red line is the furthest extent of the Eastern Empire under Justinian. That didn't last very long. About that time, Islam got started, and as the Muslims expanded, the Holy Land was one of the first areas lost to the Muslims. Jerusalem fell in 637, and the Eastern Empire gradually contracted until it covered only the gray areas that you see here. And then, of course, it contracted further and eventually collapsed, but that's not the story we're telling this morning. Now, the Western counterattack, known as the Crusades, started in about 1096. This map shows the areas that the Crusaders held at their heights. The longest lasting, actually, was the Principality of Antioch. But Jerusalem stayed in Christian hands only about 90 years. It fell to Saladin in 1187. And after that, the Holy Land was dominated by Islam, with Jews and Christians tolerated to an extent that fluctuated over time. At the end of the 13th century, that's about when the last of the Crusaders left, the Ottoman Empire began. All the colored areas on this map show the different stages of the Ottoman Empire. So just look at all that color and you can see how extensive the Ottoman Empire became at its greatest expansion. Many of the traditionally Orthodox countries fell under the Ottomans, Bulgaria, for instance. Then the Ottomans gradually declined. Greece was one of the first lands to break loose starting in the 1820s. You can see a little note in there about independence, 1830. Started their rebellion on the Feast of Annunciation. So this past week was Greek Independence Day. Then the Ottomans picked the wrong side in World War I. And as you can see, the British took over Palestine in 1917, right before the Ottoman Empire fell. The British and French occupation of the Mideast continued a 2,000-year pattern of outsiders determining the fate of the Holy Land. You'd had outsiders, you'd had the Greeks, you'd had the Romans, you'd had the Ottomans, you'd had the Seljuk Turks, and so on. One famous example of 20th century colonialism was the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is illustrated here. In 1916, middle of the First World War, there was a British diplomat named Sykes and a French diplomat named Picot, and they got together and decided how after the war they were going to divide up the former Ottoman territories. They literally just drew a line on a map from southwest to northeast and said, okay, everything on the A side will be French, everything on the B side will be British. This was a secret agreement, but after the war, it's pretty much the way things actually went for a long time, although the Russians got in there too. 1922, the League of Nations formally granted Britain what they called the mandate to rule Palestine. Now, part of that mandate was to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. I mentioned Zionism earlier. Zionism had a huge impact on British thinking for some decades before this. And the British Foreign Secretary had actually already promised during the war that they would work to create a Jewish state. He had given that commitment to one of the leaders of the World Zionist movement, which is an agreement known as the Balfour Declaration, which was also at the time secret. Europe then, after World War I, proceeded to carve countries out of the Mideast along the general lines of Sykes-Picot. Now, as I said earlier, before the fall of the Ottoman Empire, most of this area had been called Syria. They just continued to use the Roman name, which, by the way, is why the immigrants who became the ancestors of our Antiochian churches, that is the churches that were founded by immigrants, like our church, St. George in Spring Valley, were mostly called Syrians when they came here. They weren't from what we think of today as Syria, but they were from Greater Syria. Europe took that area and carved it into three countries: a smaller country called Syria, another country called Lebanon, and another country called Jordan. So if you didn't already know this, you can also see why our patriarchate, which is headquartered in Damascus, Syria, has its seminary in Balamand in Lebanon, because when that was founded, it was all part of the same territory.
And about what time was this?
The carving, this was after 1922, 20s and 30s. I can't give you exact dates, but. And there were other countries created and given to various people who were, various local people who seemed to be on the side of Britain. Sometimes that worked out, sometimes it didn't. It didn't in Iraq, but that's another story. Now, as to Palestine, World War II interrupted whatever progress the British were making towards sorting it out between the Arabs and the Jews, deciding who was going to live where. After the war, partly powered by the Nazi Holocaust, the Jews started demanding the British take action and create a homeland. And the British dragged their feet and the Jews started a guerrilla war. And finally, the British had enough. They announced they wanted to end the mandate. In November of 1947, the UN General Assembly adopted the plan shown on this map. Looks very neat. They were going to divide the land between Arabs and Jews, and Jerusalem would be a separate city governed internationally. Now, looks good on paper. There are different accounts of who accepted the plan and who rejected it. In any event, it wasn't agreed on, and a civil war started between the Arabs and the Jews. The British said, we don't care, we're through with this. They continued their pullout. They pulled out on May 14th, 1948, and the following day, May 15th, that's the Nakba, if you remember, Israel declared itself an independent state. I think the only country that recognized it right at the beginning was the US, but again, not going to get down that rabbit hole. Israel announced they were going to follow the UN resolution that you saw on the map earlier. They actually wound up taking more territory than the proposal. And in the process, hundreds of thousands of Arabs were evicted from land that in some cases they had been on for generations. So immediately the surrounding Arab countries declared war, and that war continued about a year till an armistice in 1949, which left things divided roughly like this. And Jerusalem, far from being an international city, half of it was part of Israel, half in Arab territory, a little less than half actually, which was administered by Jordan. War broke out again less than 20 years later, 1967, the famous Six-Day War. Israel decisively won that, and in the process occupied the rest of Jerusalem and all that territory called here the West Bank, which had been controlled by Jordan. There was another war in 1973. I mean, there was kind of warring going on all the time, and there has been ever since. The formal war, called the Yom Kippur War in 1973, didn't really change the borders much. And as you know, tensions and hostilities have continued to this day, including the current conflict that by some estimates has killed more than 50,000 people. One basic problem, and I referred to this earlier, is there are a lot of people here with a lot of history competing for very little room. And this slide demonstrates how little room they have, and you really don't realize that. You start walking around this area. This is roughly Israel compared to the state of Illinois. From the Dead Sea west to the Mediterranean, which is Israel's widest point, it's less than 80 miles. That's about as far as from here to Milwaukee. That's the width of the country. And if you look at the area labeled West Bank, that is Palestine, from the edge of the occupied territory, the West Bank, to the sea at the narrowest point is about 9 miles. That's how wide Israel is at its narrowest point if you don't consider the West Bank part of Israel. That's about 3/5 the width of the city of Chicago. The capital city, Tel Aviv, is not that much farther away from potential enemies. So, on the one hand, it seems like the Israelis are acting paranoid and unreasoning and so on. Keep in mind they have a lot to be paranoid about, even without the legacy of the Holocaust. Now, in 1993, Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords, brokered by Bill Clinton. They thought that was going to be setting a path toward creating a Palestinian state by defining different areas in the occupied territory, the West Bank, as A areas, B areas, and C areas. A areas supposed to be fully controlled by Palestine, by the Palestinian organization. B, Palestinian administration, but Israel providing security. And C was still to be negotiated, which pretty much means that Israel has free hand, as is the governance of Jerusalem. That was left open too. They kicked the can down the road. Very soon after the Oslo Accords, those were at the time hailed as a real breakthrough, but very soon after that, Israel started building barriers on the borders with Palestine. They refer to these barriers as fences. So it was a bit of a shock to us the first time we went and we saw what those fences actually look like. They're high concrete walls. They often have razor wire at the top. And on our second visit, 6 years later, 2019, even more walls and more watchtowers. I mean, these are fortifications. This is 18, 20 feet high, plus the watchtower. Now, the hotel we were in most of the time in 2019 was in Bethlehem, so we got to cross the walls a lot. We got to see the Palestinian side of the walls. Those are always covered in graffiti, some of the graffiti less printable than others. Also after Oslo, Israel began building fences around the settlements that Israelis had been building for years in the occupied territories. Now, the word settlement sounds like camping, or maybe it's an RV park. And they often do start out small like this one. But they fairly quickly.
He said Israelis, he meant Palestinians.
Israelis are building these settlements.
Oh.
These are Israeli settlements.
Oh.
Right? Everybody got that, right?
I
Israeli settlements.
thought they were refugee Palestinians.
These are Israeli settlements. The refugees from the Palestinian refugees are in other countries like Jordan, where we saw that huge refugee camp that basically has become a city because it's 4 or 5 generations later. This is Israelis. Ruth travels with me, and sometimes we disagree about what we saw. Usually she's right, but not in this case. Often these settlements, in quotes, grow into virtual cities, shopping centers and everything. Notice but this settlement here and this Palestinian flag on the other side of the wall, I mean fence, the fence, which is a wall, of course. Now you remember on the map what a jigsaw puzzle those A, B, and C areas from the Oslo Accord created. Well, this is why the walls snake around like that. This makes it quite challenging for a Palestinian to move around between home and work, and many Palestinians work in what is legally defined as Israel, but live on the other side, or even taking children to school. I've heard stories of taking several hours to take a kid to school because on that day the border guards were checking IDs more rigorously than usual. And Christian Palestinians have the same challenge as any other Palestinians. It's not just Muslim Palestinians. One example, this is Taibeh. This is the last remaining Christian village in Palestine. Population about 3,000, almost all Orthodox families who've lived there since the days of Byzantium. It's historically a Christian city. And this map shows it's not very far from Jerusalem, but as I mentioned a couple of slides ago, it can take hours to get to Jerusalem, depending on how tight the security checkpoints are on any given day. Palestinians routinely don't even try to fly out of the Tel Aviv airport. They'll go to Jordan and fly out of the airport there. Now, this map also at the top shows the branding of Taibeh beer, which is one of its exports. Taibeh beer, you may all be familiar with this. It was founded by a man named David Corey as a way of generating income for the city of Taibeh, and it's since branched out into wine. I was lucky enough, we had some Taibeh beer when we were there the first time. It's pretty good lager. I don't think it's being imported here yet, but maybe it is. If you see it and if you're a beer fan, try it. David is now, and I didn't realize that till I researched for this presentation, he is now a priest, and he's the priest of the church in Taibeh, took over from the longstanding priest who either retired or died. The church in Taibeh is named after who?
St. George.
St. George, of course. And if all this sounds familiar to you, it's probably because Father David's wife is Dr. Maria Corey. She's the author of the Christina books, if you have young children that you may have given those books to. She's a very popular speaker. We've heard her a couple of times. She's also an American citizen. She and Father David met. Wasn't Father David then, he was just David Corey. Maria's parents, they lived in Colorado, and they sent her to Holy Cross for college to meet a nice Greek Orthodox boy and get married. Instead, she met a nice Arab Orthodox boy and got married and has lived in Palestine ever since. And she reports that even having an American passport doesn't make it any easier to move around Israel. One of her regular speaking topics is life on the other side of the wall. Although another one of her topics is love thy neighbor, reflections from the Holy Land. And again, before we criticize the Israelis completely, we have to remember they're living with danger every day. Whenever you're in Israel, I mean, well, our guide, Father Ilya, often gets the question, is it safe to travel in Israel? And he always says, yes, it's safe. Well, to the extent that it's safe because everything is surveilled. You see surveillance cameras everywhere. That little thing up on the stalk there that looks maybe like a cross between R2-D2 and C-3PO is a surveillance camera. And they're usually surrounded by razor wire. This is on the road down from the Mount of Olives to Jerusalem. Sasha, I'll quote him again, used to summarize the Israeli Jewish outlook on life like this: they destroyed our holy places, and everyone wants to kill us. And when you grow up with that concept in mind, it's hard to trust. Those increasing hostilities have had their impact on Christians. In 1948, when Israel became a state, about 10% of the Holy Land population was Christian and had lived there for centuries. By the 90s, it had dropped to 7%. Today, it's 4%. That was the last figure I saw. It may be more like 3%. One of the reasons why churches like St. George Cicero are so huge, because Arab Christians are moving to the U.S. Okay, enough historical background. Let's start looking at the places connected with the events celebrated during Holy Week. Sasha used to say, I got this from him, again, Sasha, the places of veneration in the Holy Land tend to be of four kinds: mountains, springs, caves, and tombs. Now, granted, the mountains are more like hills compared to what we're used to. And one example up here is Mount Tabor. Its total height is about 1,900 feet. You know, in the Rockies, they wouldn't even consider that a foothill. It is reasonably steep. It's a piece of limestone that just sticks right out of the plain. Springs, caves, and tombs, they're all connected because the geology of the region, most of it is limestone, which is porous and soft, and underground water seeps through it, forming caves. Caves have been used for thousands of years, and they still are today, as dwelling places, stables, storage places, and tombs. This is from the historical site called the Tomb of the Prophets near the Mount of Olives. This network of tombs was in use from about 500 BC to about 500 AD. And tombs particularly become sites of veneration, especially very early. The tombs of the martyrs become churches. They often initially became cave churches. This is the cave church to St. Onofrius in Jerusalem. I heard Father Pat once observe that tombs were the first real estate that the Christian church owned. So the first Holy Week site of veneration we're going to visit is a tomb. It's one of the best known tombs in the Gospels. It's the tomb of Lazarus of the 4 days. Now, this story is found only in the Gospel of John. It's widely viewed as a precursor of Christ's own resurrection. To fully understand the story, you have to know some geography, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to show you a few more maps. Now, I mentioned at the start we'd be talking about Jesus' final journey to Jerusalem. That is described differently in the different Gospels. The synoptics, the three that are roughly the same, they look alike, which is why they're called synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, show a route like this. Now, this also is the only visit to Jerusalem that they mention Jesus making as an adult. John mentions several visits, usually connected with feasts in the temple, and that could either reflect John focusing on different things because his approach to the life of Jesus is very different from the synoptics, or he may just have had more detailed recollections, considering he's the one evangelist that we know for sure was with Jesus through his whole ministry. But take a look at this simpler map of the synoptic route. It may be easier to follow, but it also dramatizes one interesting point. Jesus took the long way around Samaria. Coming from Galilee, he swung to the east and went onto the east bank of the Jordan, and then crossed over, going back to Jerusalem. This was the typical route that the Jews from Galilee normally followed when they were going to Jerusalem for the holy days. They didn't want to be in Samaria because they didn't like the Samaritans, and vice versa. But in fact, Jesus did not have that prejudice against the Samaritans. He visited Samaria on many occasions. One we saw earlier when he spoke to St. Photini at the well. So why did he avoid Samaria this time? I don't know, but it may have been because that was the traditional Jewish route, and this was one of his demonstrations that he was going to a Passover sacrifice to fulfill God's promise to the Jews. Just one possibility. Anyway, the synoptics and John do agree that immediately before Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem, he was in the area east of the Jordan, province here called Perea, which just means beyond. It's also a place called Bethany beyond the Jordan. As this map says, many people believed in them there, and this area is significant historically. It was the place where John the Baptist spent a lot of his time, and it's probably where Jesus himself was baptized. Let's take a quick look at that area. This is looking west across the Jordan River. You can see the Jordan in the foreground there, that very muddy little ditch. That's basically what the Jordan is by that time, because so much water has been siphoned off for irrigation around the Sea of Galilee. And that's the area, roughly the area where Jesus was baptized. In the background there, you can just barely see there's a couple of new churches. Since the Oslo Accords, this whole area has become open to tourists and pilgrims, and quite a number of new churches have been built, 6 or 8, I think, at the last time we were there. Anyway, that's where Jesus is, Bethany beyond the Jordan, when he gets word that his friend Lazarus is seriously ill. And here's where John's gospel account begins to get interesting. It's one of the interesting things. In John 11, 5 through 6, he says, "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was." And for 2,000 years, people have been reading that and saying, in effect, what do you mean? So he stayed. He heard he was sick, so he didn't go to him. Why didn't he set out right away? Well, I think the reason may have to do with geography, more maps, and the meaning of Lazarus' resurrection. Bethany beyond the Jordan, and the Bethany, the other circle there, where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus lived, are about 20 to 30 miles apart as the crow flies, which means walking on foot in those days, at least a day's journey. Now, presumably, therefore, it took the messenger a day to get to Jesus, and it would have taken Jesus another day to get back if he had set out right away. So 2 days total. Well, when Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. So if you add the 2 days of travel to the 2 days before he set out, 4 days dead implies that Lazarus died pretty much right after the messenger left. And in fact, Jesus tells the disciples before they go back, Lazarus is dead. He already knows that. This picture, by the way, is in Bethany, not the Bethany beyond the Jordan, the other Bethany. This is the grounds of the Russian ecclesiastical mission to Jerusalem, another sign of the Russian presence. They've been there for a couple hundred years, and they run a school that teaches orphan girls, mostly Muslim orphans. So if Jesus had set out right away, he'd probably have gotten there right after the funeral, assuming that the Jews buried promptly like they did then and still usually do today. This is Ruth, that's her back, approaching the place on the mission grounds where, according to tradition, Martha met Jesus on the road and told him that Lazarus was dead and buried. That little chapel in the background is where tradition holds that Martha came to him and said to Jesus, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." And this stone marks that spot. This is a stone inside the chapel. Mary later says the same, somewhat more accusingly. And they were both right. I mean, there's stories in the gospel of Jesus curing dying people and even bringing back from the dead people who had just died. The one example that's in all the synoptics is the raising of Jairus' daughter. This is a 12th century, this is not from the Holy Land, this is a 12th century icon from a church in England that we visited last fall, but it's one of the most gorgeous icons of the raising of Jairus' daughter that I've seen. The father is in the middle here. He seems to be blocking Jesus's path, as if to say, "You came too late. It's too late to heal her. Don't bother." And Jesus, of course, is looking across to the girl, knowing that he's about to raise her. But in the case of Lazarus, Jesus is going to demonstrate even greater power over death. He's going to demonstrate the power to raise a man who's been dead for 4 days and has started to decay. As Martha says, when Jesus orders them to open the tomb, he says, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor." That's the polite translation today. The King James, I prefer the King James translation. "By this time he stinketh," is the way the King James put it. But he probably did. But Jesus raised Lazarus anyway, even though he was dead and rotting. So this final and greatest miracle, this is his last miracle before the miracle of the resurrection, is a foreshadowing of that resurrection, where he won't just revive someone, he'll revive himself, but he will then trample down death permanently. Bethany today is a Palestinian town called El Azariah. I'm sure I'm butchering the Arabic there, but that means place of Lazarus. El Azir is Arabic for Lazarus. The Muslims also venerate Lazarus. El Azaria is in one of the sea areas under the Oslo Accord, which means total control by Israel. And you can see that whole region is ringed with Israeli walls. That yellow and red line there is Israeli walls separating Israeli settlements, so-called, from the Palestinian areas. Okay, that was supposed to pop up earlier, but anyway, that's El Azaria. Here we're looking over one of those walls at the city of Lazarus. In spite of this fragmentation, Muslims and Christians seem to get along pretty well in this area. There are at least 2 Christian churches in El Azaria dedicated to Lazarus, including this Greek church. This was built in 1965. And that Greek church is very close to the traditional location of Lazarus' tomb and the house that he shared with his sisters. This spot has been venerated since very, very early on. The first church was built there in the 4th century, just about when they were able to start building churches, which means by comparison, the official veneration, the founding of the church was only about 3 centuries after the event. In other words, about as far away from the actual raising of Lazarus as we are to the birth of George Washington. I mentioned this just to make a point, which I won't go into a lot of detail, but there's often a question, how authentic are these sites? And the answer is some are more authentic than others. This one is almost 100%. It was venerated for so long, it's almost 100% certain to actually be the location. Unfortunately, in the 16th century or so, when the Ottomans had taken over, Muslims built a mosque on the site of Lazarus' tomb, probably because they wanted to venerate Lazarus, but that blocked the original entrance that Lazarus came out of. Now, not long after that, they did permit the Christians to dig a new access to the tomb, which is shown here in a photo from the early 20th century. And now today, Christians have to go down through that entrance. They go down a narrow street along the side of the mosque. That wall there is the side of the mosque. You can see the minaret there, to reach the entrance to the tomb. If you notice the orange sign on the right, that's pointing to the entrance of the tomb. You can see that it leads right under the mosque. Here's our pilgrim group from our last trip. We're coming up the other way. We're gathering under that sign. And this is a shot from our previous trip, 2013, showing Bishop Michael standing in front of the opening, reading the gospel story of Lazarus before we went into it. And notice that wall behind him is masonry. That, again, is the wall around the mosque. But as soon as you start down the stairs behind that door, you're in a tunnel that was cut out of the rock of the hill. Christians went in and chiseled the rock away to get down to the tomb. Because
the Muslims venerated?
I'm not, if you mean, do they go into this tomb? I'm not aware that they do, but I think if you pay an entrance fee, anybody can go in there. They won't ask what your religion is. Christian Scientists could probably go in there and venerate, but not formally. The formal veneration of Lazarus, if it's happening at all, is happening in the mosque. That's why they built the mosque there. 16th century, 1500s. Yeah. Relative. So for 1,000 years, the Christians were able to venerate the tomb directly. Now they can venerate the tomb because some very committed Christians chiseled this opening out of the rock and chiseled those steps to get down. Remember Sasha's comment, mountain springs, caves, and tombs. This is a cave and a tomb. I said there were 24 steps, and Christians cut those into the rock by hand. They're the only way in, they're the only way out, and you have to be in reasonably good shape to climb up them, down them. At the bottom of those stairs, now you're in the inhumation chamber, the chamber before you get into the actual tomb. You turn 180 degrees and you get down into the burial chamber itself. The man in the green shirt standing there, that's also where, according to tradition, Jesus stood when he called Lazarus back to life. According to tradition, he came into the kind of the public area of the tomb and called him to life. Immediately to the right of the man in the green shirt is the original entrance to the tomb, which was blocked when the mosque was built in the 16th century. Now, this diagram may give you a little better idea of what we're looking at here, the layout. At the upper left, those are the 24 steps down to the tomb. At the number 2 is the 180-degree turn that we just looked at, where the man in the green shirt was. That's the original entrance that was blocked. And that is the actual burial chamber itself, which is even further down. That final staircase, it looks more like a chute than steps. Now, presumably that was originally there when the tomb was used. Notice that window at the top of the picture, that little hole in the wall. That's looking down into the burial chamber itself. And Father Ilya in 2013 took a picture of us crowded into the burial chamber from that window. So you can see not only how far down it is, but how small the tomb is. The tomb's about 2 meters square. We were really good friends squeezed in there. And we also sang the first couple of verses of the hymn to the burial of Lazarus. Now, Rejoice, O Bethany, right? Now, imagine Jesus is standing up there and he calls to Lazarus. Lazarus comes forth. First of all, Lazarus has to come back to life, and he has to come back from decomposition. He's already rotting, so this all has to get taken care of. He has to get off of his burial slab and climb up those steep steps to the ground level, still wrapped in his burial shroud. This was enormously difficult for anybody, let alone somebody who's been dead for 4 days. But it was even more difficult than it looked. This is a media proposal. This was the Chosen made this representation of the Lazarus story, and it was reasonably fairly accurate, but a few things inaccurate. I'll talk about a couple of others later, but one of them is the way his burial shroud is depicted. It looks like a bathrobe with a hoodie. That is not the way Lazarus would have been wrapped for burial. The evidence is pretty clear. The Jews buried the dead in the 1st century by wrapping a very long sheet around the corpse, head to foot, and then binding it in place around the body with strips of cloth. Now, we'll look at this in a little bit more this afternoon in a little more detail, but for right now, just take the Apostle John's word for it. He says Lazarus was, quote, bound hand and foot with grave clothes. In spite of that, Lazarus climbed out under his own power when he heard Jesus call out, Lazarus, come forth. So life has to have come back to him pretty strongly, very quickly, and a really compelling desire to rejoin his master. According to tradition, Lazarus recovered enough to live another 30 years, during which time he served as Bishop of Kitea on the island of Cyprus, which is shown here. He's shown here in a Russian icon. Lazarus is still venerated on Cyprus, particularly at this church in the town of Larnaca, where his relics were originally kept there because he died there before they were taken to Constantinople in the 9th century. And this is supposed to be his original tomb on Cyprus. Now, I got these pictures off the web. We haven't yet visited Cyprus, although we're kind of hoping to in the fall, and I'll talk about future pilgrimages at the end of the morning. One side note, though, despite the fact that they moved the relics, they translated the relics, as they say, to Constantinople in the 800s, many years later, they were digging around and they found some bones. And by inscriptions and other evidence, they were identified as having belonged to Lazarus. So it looks like the people of Cyprus kept a few bones to themselves before they sent the rest to Constantinople. And those bones are now interred in this reliquary in the Larnaca church. Lazarus is there awaiting his second and his final resurrection. So getting back to the gospel story, the raising of Lazarus, John says, was such a public miracle that many believed in Jesus. But Bethany was very close to Jerusalem, and many believing in Jesus meant that the Pharisees heard about it, and they were really annoyed, and they finally started to plot to kill him. John says, therefore, Jesus heard that, and he left Bethany for a city called Ephraim, about 10 miles away from Jerusalem. And I'm pointing this out because Ephraim is modern-day Tibet, which we visited earlier, the last Christian village left in Palestine. Jesus stayed there until about 6 days before the Passover, when he returned to Bethany. So we've reached finally the last week of Jesus' life before the crucifixion. And the Orthodox commemoration of that week, of course, starts with the Sunday, that is Palm Sunday, the entrance into Jerusalem. So it is now time for us to take a look at Jerusalem, the holy city, and guess what we're going to see for the next couple of slides? Maps, you're right. Remember, after the war that erupted when Israel became a state, from there until 1967, there was a large chunk of territory west of the Jordan River that was controlled by the country of Jordan. Israel's border at that point was so-called Green Line, the 1949 armistice. It extended to most of historic Jerusalem, but not East Jerusalem, which is shown here in orange. And East Jerusalem is where most of the holy sites are. So after the 1967 war, when Israel took over the West Bank, they also took over Jerusalem, and they started to grow it as their new capital. They fairly quickly moved their capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. This is a tourist map showing most of modern Jerusalem, shows a lot of modern hotels, shows the Knesset or Parliament building over there and so on. This is way bigger than Jerusalem historically was for most of its history. You go to Jerusalem now, you're going to see a modern city. Remember, most of what you're seeing is very, very recent. Back in up until that expansion, this area called the Old City was essentially Jerusalem. And that's the part that's surrounded by those 16th century Ottoman walls that I showed you earlier. Now, this started to be called the Old City only in the middle of the 19th century when they began to build some new city around it. It's today traditionally divided into 4 quarters. They're called Christian, Muslim, Armenian, and Jewish. That division also only dates back to about the 9th century. It's largely arbitrary. For one thing, of course, Armenians are Christians, so right there, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And the designations don't mean that those quarters are only for, the Muslims have to stay in the Muslim quarter and the Christians have to stay in the Christian quarter. 7 of the 12 Roman Catholic Stations of the Cross that the pilgrims visit, the Roman Catholic pilgrims visit, are in the Muslim quarter. But this gives you a general layout of the town, the city today. It is very, very, very small. It's only about 3/8 of a square mile. It's maybe 150 square blocks. But in that 3/8 of a mile lives something like 35,000 people. That means if you calculate the population density and compare it to Manhattan, it's about 25% more dense than Manhattan. If you've ever been to New York, that's saying something. The streets, of course, are very narrow, and sometimes they're even narrower. And they're usually full of tourists, like my wife Ruth with our pilgrim group here in 2019. Mostly, even though people are crammed in together, they get along pretty well. I do remember a couple instances. One instance, we were walking along and there was a man walking in the other direction from his dress and his beard and fringes and so on, obviously a hyper-Orthodox Jew. And he was basically striding through the street, shouldering anybody who wasn't an Orthodox Jew out of his way. And any goyim had better get out of his way or get knocked over. And one time, I think it was in the previous trip, we were wandering around the Old City. We turned a corner, and there were a couple of Israeli soldiers standing there with submachine guns, not pointing them at anybody. They were just standing there, and they gestured to us to turn around and leave. I didn't ask what was going on. We just turned around and left. Now, as small as the Old City is, in Jesus' time, it was even smaller. This is a Greek map that shows roughly what it looked like in 30 AD. That's the temple in the northeast corner. That's what's now the Muslim quarter. We'll go into this in more detail later, but just note right now that the red line there traces the route of Christ from his arrest in Gethsemane, that's what the Greek says there, Gethsemane, through the city and out through Golgotha, which is also in Greek there, immediately outside the city walls. This gives you a little bit more three-dimensional look at ancient Jerusalem, particularly the temple, which is now smack in the middle of the picture. So now we're looking at it from the northeast. This is a wonderful model, and any tourist who goes to Jerusalem would certainly see it. It's a 1:50 scale model of the ancient city at the time of Christ. It's more than 1,000 meters square meters overall. It was commissioned by a Jewish hotel owner whose son had died in the 1948 war, and it was in his memory. And after he had it on display in his hotel for many years, he gave it to the Israeli Museum where it is today. It was designed with a lot of input from archaeologists. There are some quibbles about its accuracy, but overall, it's pretty good look at what it looked like.
It's outside?
It is out. Well, it has to be outside. I mean, it is outside. You don't get a whole lot of rain in Israel, so it's not a problem. This is a closer shot. We're now looking in the other direction, pretty much from Golgotha across the city to the temple. Among other things, you see that there was a wall encircling the city. Every city in those days had a wall encircling it. The wall runs into the temple. The temple's eastern wall is itself the city wall at that point. Now, when Jesus came to Jerusalem from Bethany on what we now call Palm Sunday, there were several aspects of great symbolic significance. You may already know all of these. Of course, to start with, the people laying palm branches and crying, Hosanna, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel, shows they saw him as Messiah, as the one that they thought was going to restore Israel to prominence and secular power. But Jesus' choice of beast to ride on sends a completely opposite signal. And you wonder how many in the crowd picked that up. He was riding on a donkey. A donkey is not a fighting animal. A mule is a fighting animal. A donkey is not. It's meek. It's small. Zechariah 9:9 actually predicts this. He says, behold your king. He's humble and riding on an ass. The donkey is a poor man's beast, and it's also a shepherd's beast. This is some Palestinian shepherds who crossed our path one day on one of our pilgrimages. He's riding on a donkey. He's the donkey is smaller than he is. That symbolizes Christ as the good shepherd. Why is he riding a donkey? Because shepherds ride donkeys. And it was also a donkey that Abraham used to carry the wood when he went up to Mount Moriah. By the way, Mount Moriah was the location of the temple many years later, to sacrifice Isaac. So this also symbolizes Christ as the sacrifice. And there's another piece of symbolism that emphasizes that point. I mentioned to you earlier my comment that God invented history here. God writes history, and he writes history very much the way a good author writes things. He builds a lot of symbols into the process of history. This is the gate. Well, it will be the gate. Okay, I'm sorry. The gate by which Jesus chose to enter Jerusalem. Now, the most direct route from Bethany, which is east of the city, would have been just going in through the eastern gate. That's known as the Golden Gate. Now, that happens also to be, in Jewish tradition, the gate through which they thought the Messiah was going to enter when he came. So that would have been a logical place for him to enter. But instead, Jesus entered through the northeast gate. Now, on the one hand, there's a lot of on the one hands, on the other hands here. On the one hand, that is traditionally where conquerors entered. But of course, conquerors didn't enter riding donkeys. That gate is also adjacent to the sheep pool, which is where animals were cleaned before they were sacrificed in the temple. So then Jesus entered the temple compound through the sheep gate, which is where the sheep, after they'd been washed, were brought into the temple for sacrifice, emphasizing Jesus as the Lamb of God, as John the Baptist had said 3 years before that, and Palm Sunday emphasizes that. Now, it also represents a very public display, almost as if Jesus was thumbing his nose at the temple authorities and daring them to respond. He spent the next 2 days of Holy Week in the temple itself. So let's go back and zero in on the temple for a little bit. We're back to that model. Remember now, this was Herod's temple. There were really 3 temples in Jewish history. The first was built by Solomon and destroyed by the Babylonians several centuries later. The second temple was the one that Zerubbabel built after the Babylonian captivity ended about 50 years later. He was sent back, if you remember, with actual money and support from Darius to rebuild the temple. This is about the end of the 6th century BC. Now, that temple suffered a lot over the next few centuries from invasions, probably earthquakes and other things. It was in fairly bad shape by the 1st century. So in the 1st century BC, Herod the Great, so-called, decided to rebuild it on a much grander scale. Now, Herod was a tyrant. He wasn't even really Jewish, but he was a great builder, which is why he's called the Great. And he talked the temple authorities into letting him replace the temple with a new temple. He started in about 20 BC, and that work was still going on when he died about 4 BC. You know, he probably sold it to the temple authorities saying, hey, I've got all the materials ready. I've got all the contractors. It'll be over in a jiffy. You know, well, the work was still going on probably in about 64 AD when it finally was completed. That was only about 6 years before it was destroyed. But most of it was probably finished by Jesus' time. In addition to rebuilding the temple building itself, which he couldn't play with very much, he expanded the space around it. According to one source that I consulted, this was the largest place of worship in the entire ancient world, the whole territory of the temple. That whole area in the foreground was extended out to the edge of the Kidron Valley. He actually had to build up because it was, the land went down into the Kidron Valley. So he built up many, many stories above that. Now, under that enormous plaza were vaulted chambers that have only recently been excavated. These images from the web, because they weren't even open for visitors in 2019, the last time we were there. There were rooms for ceremonies, probably banquets, and extensive mikvahs, the ritual baths that Jews took before they entered the temple. This is a sketch of the main entrance. Now we're coming back to the south. This is up a massive staircase, remains of which are still visible today. This is one of the few places you can actually see something from Jesus' time, although I think this may have been excavated a bit. At the base of the staircase there were entrances to more mikvahs, which have also been excavated. And the structure of the mikvah, by the way, is echoed. You can probably tell the similarity between a ritual bath and baptism, except that you don't get baptized more than once. You do take a ritual bath every time you're unclean. The structure of mikvahs is echoed in a lot of ancient Christian baptismal pools. That is, they always had separate stairways. You took one stairway going down, you washed, and once you were cleansed, you went up the other stairway, and there was a division between them so that you didn't get stained again. Just to complete this whirlwind view of the temple, here's one of the sections of the western wall that have been excavated. Now, all of these structures are not technically part of the temple itself. The temple was that little building, and it's long since gone. This is all foundation work. So when the Jews are praying at the section of the western wall where they pray, not this section, but another section, as pious as that is, they're leaning their heads on a wall and praying, and actually leaning their heads on a basement, not the temple itself. Even the remaining walls that you can see today are not completely unchanged from Jesus' day. I mean, one example, getting back one more time to this model, the Golden Gate. Remember, that was the entrance that the Messiah was going to come in on, which Jesus did not use. In Herod's temple, it was this little door with stairs coming up from the Kidron Valley, and he got into the foundation and then presumably went upstairs to get to the temple itself. This is the Golden Gate today. This is a shot from the Mount of Olives, and that's a Jewish cemetery in the foreground, modern Jewish cemetery. This, pardon me?
Where's the door?
Well, that's it.
Ah.
That was it. It's been closed since 1541. And nobody's quite sure who rebuilt it. They rebuilt it on a much more massive scale than the original Golden Gate. It might have been Christians at the time of Justinian. It might have been Muslims somewhat after that. Whoever built it, they kept closing it and opening it until finally they sealed it for good in 1541. Possibly because the Muslims knew the prophecy that Messiah was going to come back and restore the Jews to prominence, and said, well, he's going to come back. We're going to seal the door he's going to come in through. Not sure that was the reasoning. Now, when Jesus did enter the temple, he continued confronting the Pharisees and the Sadducees with what's called the cleansing of the temple. Took a handful, as illustrated here, he took a handful of ropes, whipped all the money changers who were using the temple as a profit center. Now, again, difference between the synoptics and John. Synoptics say this happened the day after Palm Sunday. John places it much earlier in his ministry. He doesn't place it during Holy Week at all. John also describes more than one visit to Jerusalem, so maybe Jesus whipped the money changers twice. We don't really know. But as that icon suggests, the cleansing did not happen in the temple itself. I mean, if you look at that icon, you can see the temple buildings in the background. This happened in one of the courtyards outside, probably the Gentiles' court. That was one of the few places a non-Jew could go. There were actually signs telling visitors, and one of them has been found, telling visitors, if you're not Jewish, do not go past this point or you'll be killed, penalty of death. And those were the points. Now, Jewish women could go as far as the court of women, which is about 6 feet up from the court of the Gentiles. Jewish men got another 10 feet up to the court of Israel. Beyond that, only priests. And of course, the Holy of Holies up there at the top could only be entered by the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. The morning after the cleansing of the temple, Jesus continued to teach in the temple, and we have documentary evidence in the Gospels that the Pharisees and Sadducees were plotting to kill him big time. That afternoon, Jesus took the disciples to the Mount of Olives, where he gave a lengthy prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem, which is recorded in all four Gospels. This is a shot looking up at the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem. Like other mountains I mentioned, it's not much of a mount. It's not very steep, but all the other land is completely flat, so it looks like a mountain. This is across the Kidron Valley from Jerusalem. Bethany is low on one of the slopes of the Mount of Olives, so it wasn't far from where he was staying. And interestingly enough, today, the most prominent landmark that you see when you look up at the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem is the Russian church of St. Mary Magdalene. This was a bit of a shock to us when we first went there, walking around Jerusalem, all of a sudden seeing an obviously Russian church, very, very prominent. But again, it reflects the substantial Russian presence in the Holy Land for at least the last 2 or 3 centuries. And there was a significant Russian presence and Russian influence in the Antiochian patriarchate, staying independent, becoming essentially an Arab patriarchate, but that's another historical story. This is on the Mount of Olives. Yeah. This particular church was built by Tsar Alexander III in 1888, and St. Elizabeth, the new martyr, was buried there in 1921 after they dug her relics out of the well that she and other supporters of the Tsar were thrown into and killed. I have pictures of us venerating what we could get at in that church, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over those. Now, about the only incident recorded in the Gospels on Holy Wednesday was an evening meal at the house of Simon the leper. A woman anointed Jesus' head with very expensive ointment. You remember the story. Now, anointing probably happened to Jesus more than once. I love the line in our Synaxarion for the Holy Wednesday bridegroom matins, which is, of course, celebrated on the evening of Holy Tuesday. The line says, the more accurate and exacting of the commentators on the 4 Gospels say that 2 women anointed the Lord, one long before his passion, one a few days before. I like that little editorial, most accurate and exacting. Now, Matthew and Mark don't identify the woman who did it this night, Holy Wednesday, but John names her Mary. Now, the assumption is Mary is Lazarus' sister, Lazarus and Martha's sister. Hold that thought. Those 2 anointings are the occasion, as I'm sure you remember, of one of the most beautiful moments in all the beautiful services in Holy Week, getting back to that Wednesday Orthros, which is held on the evening of Holy Tuesday, the so-called hymn of Cassiani, which is the Doxasticon toward after the Apostica. Even though that hymn is assigned to Holy Wednesday, it actually focuses mostly on the earlier anointing by the sinful woman. And there's an interesting side story about that particular hymn. Cassiani was a very devoted nun and abbess of a monastery, but before she became a monastic, the Emperor Theophilus wanted to marry her, and she turned him down, became a nun. And some time after that, Theophilus visited her monastery and came across her desk. She had apparently been writing this hymn and had walked away from the desk. And he looked at the manuscript, and she had ended, I will kiss thy feet. And supposedly Theophilus added the line, those feet at whose sound Eve hid herself for fear when she heard thee walking in paradise, which is one of the kind of climaxes of that hymn, if you're familiar with it. But I digress. Any event, the cost of the ointment offended some of the disciples, particularly Judas, according to the Gospel of John. And Jesus chided him and the other disciples for being offended. He said, the anointing is for my burial. It was after that, at least according to Mark, that Judas went out and went to the priests and made a deal to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And that's what you see here. You don't see many portraits of Judas. This one is on a wall of the Roman Catholic Church at Magdala. And it shows Judas holding the money bag. I'm not really sure why they included Judas on this. All the rest of the icons in this church, it's a relatively modern church. Magdala has been excavated a lot the last 10 or 20 years, and I would love to show you pictures of that, but not entirely relevant to Holy Week, but all the other relics or all the other icons in this church are saints. They all have halos except Judas. I don't know why they included Judas, unless, well, he was one of the apostles. They may have just felt they needed to complete the set. But it might just possibly also reflect another tradition that the Mary who anointed Jesus was not Lazarus' sister, but Mary Magdalene, from whom he had chased 7 demons. Mary Magdalene, of course, is Mary from Magdala. This was her hometown. It may just be that's why they included this. I'm not quite sure. But in any case, Judas took the money. So the next major event related in the Gospels is, of course, the Last Supper, or more correctly, the Mystical Supper. This icon is from the tomb of the Theotokos, which I hope we'll have time to visit at the end of the afternoon. We'll see. Now, like most icons in the Mystical Supper, including Leonardo's, it's not realistic. It's not intended to be. For one thing, the disciples wouldn't have been all on one side of the table, but obviously, if they weren't, half of them would have their back to the camera, as it were. So that's why it's always portrayed this way. More significantly, people did not sit at table like that dining in those days. They reclined at table. And I've always felt, just as a side note, that when the gospel says that, when the Gospel of John actually says that he was leaning on Jesus' bosom, I've always felt that just meant they were all sitting around on couches and he was next to Jesus. Otherwise, sitting on chairs leaning against his bosom would be a little odd. But probably it just means that John was next to Jesus. Now, getting back to places where these things occurred, visiting the place of the mystical supper is a little problematic. There is a traditional location shown here on this map, described as the cenacle, which comes from the Latin conaculum, which means dining room. It's just outside the ancient city walls here, but that means it's inside the old city as it exists today. You remember that whole discussion. It's on the slopes of what is identified today as Mount Zion. You see that right next to the circle there. That is different from the Temple Mount, which was originally designated as Mount Zion. When the Muslims took that over, the Jews started calling this Mount Zion. Now, the cenacle is an upper room, which is what's described in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. This is us in our 2013 pilgrimage. There's a plaque on the wall at the right there, describes the site in 3 languages. And there's on the left enough. I seem to be looking around with some puzzlement. It may be because I was trying to figure out how this could really be the upper room of the mystical supper, and later the upper room in which Pentecost was celebrated, when we know that all the structures in Jerusalem were destroyed when the city was demolished in 70 AD. So obviously this is not actually the upper room per se. And that's in likelihood even more obvious. The architecture is obviously not first century. It looks more Norman. In fact, this part that we're in here is probably Crusader, built onto something from the 4th or 5th century. All of which doesn't prove that this isn't necessarily the site where the upper room existed. This is an outside shot of that same building. And you can really see the layers of history, the different strata of rock in the walls there. It has been rebuilt and added to over the centuries. And those massive blocks at ground level are probably from the time of Herod's temple. So this possibly is the location of the mystical supper, even though when you're looking around at that room, it's not the actual room. There is, however, one other candidate for the mystical supper, and I'm just including this because I've just discovered it, frankly. We didn't visit this. It turned up in my research. Just inside the Jaffa Gate, which is near the Armenian quarter in the Old City, is the monastery of St. Mark. This is a Syriac church. That is, it's Oriental Orthodox in communion with the Copts and others. And down at the basement of this building is a small room that they say was the room of the Last Supper, the mystical supper. It's small enough, it could just about have held a supper for 13 people. It's not an upper room today, but the Syriacs point out, and they're right, 2,000 years ago, it was probably way above ground level. So this could be it. We'll never know this side of heaven. Wherever it took place, after supper, when they had sung a hymn, probably one of the Psalms, Jesus and the disciples headed back across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives. Only 11 disciples now, because as you recall, Judas had left. Jesus told him that he predicted that he would betray him and said to Judas, go do what you're going to do. And he left. This is our 2013 pilgrim group climbing the mountain. And you can see there the Russian church is in the background. This is a day shot of the Mount of Olives. The Garden of Gethsemane is low on the slopes. It's on the left in this picture, about where this Roman Catholic church is visible. We'll see that church in a minute. This was the Gethsemane and this really is Gethsemane, 2,000 years ago and today. This is where he brought his disciples that night. Now, the term garden is misleading. It's actually more of a pleasure garden today than it was 2,000 years ago. It's not back then. It wasn't a place you went to sniff flowers, and we'll see that same misunderstanding when we talk to the tomb of Christ this afternoon. The word garden that's translated as garden really means more like cultivated field. If you've ever lived in a small town, farmland starts right outside the city limits, and this was no exception. The word Gethsemane means oil press. And in the Mediterranean of that day, or today for that matter, oil means one thing, means olives. In other words, Gethsemane was an olive grove. And even today, olive trees dominate. Now, olive trees can live hundreds and thousands of years. They grow out of a subterranean root system that practically never dies. It just keeps adding new wood, which is why there's so much artwork made out of olive wood that you can get in the Holy Land and other places. The wood is always dying and getting replaced with new wood. We had a presentation by our Bishop John a couple of years ago, and he talked on this subject. He said a newly planted olive tree takes an entire human lifespan before it starts producing olives. And none of these was newly planted. There's one olive tree. I just saw this. There's an olive tree on Crete that has been positively, scientifically dated to be at least 2,000 years and probably more like 3,000 or 4,000 years old. So it is no stretch to imagine that some of these olive trees you see today in Gethsemane were already mature when Jesus prayed under them 2,000 years ago. Jesus is, after all, the Christ. That means the anointed one, which means literally the oiled one. So it's no coincidence that he comes to Gethsemane, the place of the oil press, to pray for his father on the night before his sacrifice to become the saving oil for all of us. Another example of God writing symbolism into history. Go back to that Roman Catholic church we saw at a distance. This is called the Church of the Agony. Over the door is this Latin inscription that records Jesus' words to the disciples before he went off to pray. And my translation of that is, "Wait you here and keep watch with me," which they did not do very well. This is a very small basilica, and it is focused entirely on that one moment in history. According to some of the church fathers, this spot is really where Jesus' sacrifice begins, in Gethsemane. Before he's arrested, before he's tried, before he's flogged, before he's fitted with the crown of thorns, before he's crucified, this is the moment where he completely yields his will to the will of the Father. And he prays, as you recall, till sweat runs off him like great drops of blood. That might be a metaphor, but it might also be a medical condition called hematotrosis, which I'm probably butchering, but in certain cases of severe mental anxiety, the sympathetic nervous system gets so aroused, invoking the fight or flight response, that it causes hemorrhage of the blood vessels supplying the sweat glands. So he may very well have been oozing drops of blood as he prayed in his agony. Notice in this icon, all these pictures are from the Church of the Agony. Notice how the olive trees seem to be bending over him as if they're sympathizing with him. Now, several times, as you recall, he comes back to the disciples and finds they've fallen asleep. He chides them, goes right back to the rock where he's praying. And the Basilica of the Agony is built right on that rock. You can see pilgrims gathered around exposed rock on the floor of the church. They're venerating the rock where Jesus prayed. Then, after Jesus has struggled for hours, Judas arrives with an armed band, and he tells the soldiers to arrest the man he will kiss. And then he comes up to Jesus and gives him a kiss. This is the kiss that Jews usually use to greet a rabbi. It's a sign of greeting and respect, but in this case, it's a sign of betrayal. The Latin at the bottom of that icon says, "Friend, why do you come? Do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" Jesus' comment to Judas. Now, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus then asks the soldiers who they're seeking, knowing perfectly well who they were seeking. And when they said Jesus of Nazareth, he said, "I am he." Now, the Latin here is just that simple statement, ego sum, I am he. But my understanding from Greek scholars is that isn't exactly the way it's phrased. What he really said was simply, I am, which is a direct translation of the words that God spoke to Moses. When Moses asked God for his name, he said, I am who I am. And interestingly enough, those of you who were with us in the Akathist, the final dismissal prayer that Father Andrew read this morning mentioned God, he who is, in quotes. In other words, when Jesus responds to the soldiers and he says, I am, they're hearing the voice of God, and they all fall to the ground as they're portrayed right here. That's the second line of the Latin. And notice in this icon, even the trees are being blown back by the force of hearing God saying his name. But of course, the guards recover, they arrest Jesus, they bind him, they lead him back across the Kidron through the gates of Jerusalem to face trial. Now, from here on, the rest of the story of Holy Week happens within the walls of the old city. From here, I'm going to stop right at the moment because I see it is noon. We can wait here. I've got probably another 10 minutes or so, or we can keep going and start at 1:30 where I intended to start. Either way, organizers, somebody make a decision.
Keep going. Aziza, Patty and I will make sure lunch is set up, and so that way when you finish, we'll all be good.
You can immediately eat. Okay, good,
So
good. Okay. Okay, so we're back in the walls of the old city, although not necessarily within the walls of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. This is a Roman, as you can tell probably, this is a Roman Catholic presentation of the stations of what they call the Via Dolorosa, the sorrowful way, otherwise known as the Stations of the Cross. Now, in neither of our trips did we try to walk the Via Dolorosa. For one thing, it's a Roman Catholic thing. The stops are somewhat arbitrary. They've actually been revised a number of times over the centuries, and they were only finalized in this form in the 19th century or 18th century. So some of the sites are interesting, but just following the path, it's a good devotional exercise, but you're not seeing a lot of authentic stuff. And as I said, very little survives in Jerusalem of anything that was built above the ground. Now, one site that does seem to be contemporary, interestingly enough, is not on the Roman Catholic Via Dolorosa. It's the monastery of the Praetorium. The Greek Orthodox have maintained this since the medieval era, believing that this is part of the fortress where Pilate judged Jesus. Down below street level, there's an old prison. It's basically a pit. And this is pretty much what ancient jails look like. We saw a similar pit looking at the prison of Paul and Silas in Greece. They were maximum security. You throw them into a pit and they can't get out. So there's no way they can get out. Nothing can happen without a ladder. This icon is in that monastery. I've never seen this icon anywhere outside of Jerusalem. It illustrates how the prisoner would be fastened into stocks once he was thrown into that pit. This is much like the description of Paul and Silas in Acts. You stick his fingers through those holes, put a chain around his ankles, and there's no way for him to escape.
Stick his legs.
Hmm?
Stick his legs through the holes,
What did I say?
fingers.
Okay, I'm glad somebody's listening. Right, stick his legs through the holes. Those were legs, not fingers. Now, the stocks, in this case, you can see, are just holes carved out of the stone shelf. This is a close-up. This is in the Greek monastery of the Praetorium, and it's showing the actual stocks that they believe Jesus was fastened into. And according to tradition, Jesus was kept here till he was called for trial by Pilate. Now, I have to tell you, in the interest of full disclosure, this is the place of Jesus' prison. There are at least 4 other places in Jerusalem with a tradition of having been Jesus' prison. One of them is probably accurate. I'll take this one. One of them, which we won't see, is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but it looks very similar to this. So this was standard. You can say this was standard ancient prison equipment. Now, another possibility for the Praetorium was the Antonia fortress, which is adjoined the temple. It acted as its military defense. You noticed it in previous shots of this model, but probably didn't know that was a fortress, not part of the temple. That's over here in the northern edge of the city on that Greek map you saw earlier. One other possibility is that Pilate might have been staying with Herod Antipas. He was the tetrarch of Galilee who was visiting Jerusalem at the time, you recall. And he had a palace on the other side of Jerusalem, which in this Greek is called the Praetorium. That identification is not all that certain. One of the problems with identifying where was the Praetorium is even if you had a lot of remains from buildings of that area, you would never find a carving saying this is the Praetorium, because Praetorium didn't designate a building. Praetorium was where the governor happened to be at the time. Very much like Air Force One is whatever airplane the president happens to be flying on. At the moment he's in flying at it, it's Air Force One. After he gets off, it's not. So looking for a building that definitely was the Praetorium in Jerusalem is kind of futile. But if that theory is right, if he was staying in the palace with Herod, the remains of that are under this building, which is called the Tower of David. It has nothing historically to do with David. It's a mishmash of various eras. But underneath, recent archaeology has uncovered ruins on a lower level that might be Herod's palace. This again is pictures I had to take off the web because this wasn't open for visitors when we were there in 2019. Maybe we'll get back someday and see it. All kinds of banquet rooms and so on available there. Wherever Jesus was tried, you know the story as well as I do. Pilate tried to get out of sentencing Jesus by sending him to Herod. Herod got no satisfaction from Jesus, sent him back to Pilate. And just to make sure, parenthetically, what Herod we're talking about here, it's not the same Herod we were talking about rebuilding the temple. He was already dead. He died in 4 BC. He's not the Herod that Joseph was so afraid of that he moved the Holy Family to Galilee rather than going back to Bethlehem when they came from Egypt. The Herod we're talking about was Herod Archelaus, who by that time, that was Herod Archelaus, who by that time had been fired by Augustus for incompetency. The Herod we're talking about here is Herod Antipas, Archelaus's brother. He was the one who had killed John the Baptist and was interested in Jesus because he thought maybe this was John the Baptist come back to life. He ruled Galilee, the northern province, but he had a place in Jerusalem, sort of like a very high-class royal Airbnb. All the Herods on this genealogy, they were all rotten. Some were more rotten than others. Now, Pilate did try, according to the Gospels, tried to apply Roman justice and logic, and he tried to resist finding Jesus guilty because there really was no legal reason for finding him guilty, but he finally gave up to the pressure of the priests and the mob. He condemned him, had him flogged, put a crown of thorns on his head, and sent him to be crucified. So, interesting irony here, Pilate, as represented in this icon, crowned him as king, not realizing that he really is the King of Kings. There's reason to believe that that crown of thorns was really more like a cap than like a circle shown on the previous icon. More crowns in those days were more caps than they were circlets, and it's also crueler. But in addition to being a device of torment, here's another symbol that God wrote into history. It's a symbol of the curse of Adam that Christ came to abolish. Remember God's words to Adam when he was expelled from the garden: thorns and thistles the ground shall bear forth for you. Well, here are thorns being placed on God's head. When Judas learned that Jesus had been condemned, he had a change of heart, and he went back to the priest to return the 30 pieces of silver. There they jeered at him. He went off and hanged himself. So the jeering is on the left, the hanging is on the right. This icon is not from the Holy Land. This is from the lower level of a church in Russia on the outskirts of Moscow at a place called Butovo, which was a killing field for political prisoners during the worst days of Stalin's oppression. But it's about the only Orthodox church where I've ever seen a depiction of Judas' suicide. The priests used the money that Judas had thrown back at them to purchase a field to bury foreigners in, often translated strangers, but I'm pretty sure foreigners is more accurate. The traditional location for that field today is below the monastery of St. Onofrius, the edge of Jerusalem, shown here. This is an aerial view. I had to get off the web. We didn't fly around much when we were there. Now, another misconception that I had before I went to the Holy Land, this field is described in the gospel as the potter's field. So potters make things out of clay. I'd always assumed this was a bunch of clay that you dug graves in. Well, you don't dig graves in the Holy Land. You bury them in caves, and that's what the potter's field is. It is a rocky bowl with lots of caves. Some of these were used as tombs. Historically, some of them were occupied by monks in the Byzantine period. Sasha, again, holy places in the Holy Land are mountain springs, caves, or tombs, sometimes more than one at the same time. Another interesting sidelight, this monastery is in what's called the Hinnom Valley. During the first temple period, it said that some apostate Jews went into the Hinnom Valley to sacrifice children there to the god Moloch. So the name of the place in Hebrew is Gel Hinnom. That became Gehenna in Greek. And you'll recognize that as a symbol for hell. Jesus uses that term 11 times in the Gospels. And the connection with Judas is ironic. St. Theophan says that the reason Judas was condemned was not because he betrayed Jesus, but because he despaired and killed himself instead of asking forgiveness. Peter betrayed him too. He asked forgiveness, but by not asking forgiveness, by killing himself, he cut himself off permanently from God's mercy. Okay, so we have reached the Friday of Holy Week. Jesus is on his way to the cross. This is the Roman Catholic third station of the cross in Jerusalem, the so-called first falling. Not a very historical location. Depiction is probably inaccurate, but I'll wait to get into detailed descriptions of crucifixion till after we have some lunch, because I don't want to spoil your appetite. Closing, I want to just do a quick commercial. The pilgrimages that Ruth and I have been blessed to take for the last 12 years or so, which are the basis for these presentations, are all arranged by a company called Orthodox Tours, which is operated by Father Ilya Gotlinsky, whom I've mentioned a couple of times. He's an OCA priest. He started Orthodox Tours as a sideline, now runs it full time. He is very knowledgeable. He has a passion for connecting people with authentic Orthodox sites, but he also has a genius for finding great local guides like Sasha. He has 13 tours scheduled this year, including 3 to the Holy Land. Yes, he is touring the Holy Land despite the war. And if you're interested in considering any of them, I have copies of this. It's all the tours, as well as a general brochure. They're over here on the piano. Feel free to take one, take it home, and think about going. The next tour we're going to be going on is to the Baltic capitals in Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in June. Seriously thinking about going to Cyprus in October, because it's probably the only opportunity we'll ever get to visit Lazarus' tomb, but we'll see. So thank you for your attention, and let's have some lunch.
Well, so we have 2 water.